I read an interesting passage from your book, New York Jew, which describes a scene at a Columbia bar where you and Mark were watching I guess, a taping of McCarthy. Do you remember that incident?
Yes, I remember it all too well. But let me say first that the most lasting impression Mark Van Doren left on me was of his personal magnetism. Now, I described the scene after one of his classes when the whole class, the seminar, didn't want to let him go after what we thought was a particularly beautiful lecture. So we went down to the subway station here at 116th Street and went down, talking all the way on the subway. And we didn't get into the house. We were hoping to get in, but the thing stopped at the door. But still, I can't think of any other teacher who had that kind of quality. And if you ask me what magnetism is, what his magnetism was, I can only say that it was the effect he gave of someone who was thoroughly committed to his own spirit, to his own work, to his own culture, for whom teaching was really a very noble and important thing, who was very proud of the influence he had. And by the way, the Columbia was always had, because of the New York setting and because of the fact that Nicholas Murray Butler couldn't quite keep out all the foreign types who wanted to go to Columbia. It had an extraordinarily vibrant student body, you see. And at one time, a friend of mine, a Canadian scholar who taught history here in the 50s, said it was quite clear that Columbia had the greatest faculty in the country. It certainly had the most interesting students, though they weren't like students at Harvard or Yale. They were, because of being in New York and the village, they tended to be rather more lawless. We know something about that. And I had a feeling that a student who came from Illinois in the 50s or 60s, went to Columbia, would immediately drag himself down to the village and put on a costume in order to look right with his classmates, you see. Now, but among all these people, for me, Mark stood out because of this magnetism. A lot of professors then were really great committed scholars. Columbia had a very famous critic, Lionel Trilling. It had a remarkable faculty in history and in law. But for people like me, and very especially for me, Mark stood out because of what I call his nobility, a quality which is now quite lost, you see. How shall I define it? It meant that you knew what you wanted to do, that you were faithful to yourself in every sense, but also that you were generous to students, the rest of it. Now, nowadays, as you know, in American universities, there's a lot of what is called political correctness, you see. If you happen to be a white male, which you cannot always help, you're immediately put down by people. And there's a really terrible kind of cultural, what I call the Chinese Cultural Revolution, American style, people trying to indoctrinate you and the rest of it. Well, I can't imagine someone like Mark Van Doren in that setting at all, For him, it was literature, as it was for me, there are people, and we're old-fashioned. In that sense, I become a very old-fashioned type, too, for whom literature is really the reason why you live. It's the end of things, you see. And remember that Mark had this both ways, both as a teacher and as a writer, something I've always hoped to do in my own career, which means that you're always living with literature and in literature, you see. Nowadays, that would be relatively impossible. For obvious reasons, literature does not occupy the same role it did in people's culture. What used to be bookstores around Columbia are now video shops, you see. And frankly, everything is too turbulent. People don't believe that the written word can have that much effect on them, you see. And they get their kicks and their pleasure out of movies or films or TV, obviously. And there's a certain kind of impatience involved there, you see. The idea of spending years and years on a book on Hawthorne, which might just not be a bestseller, would seem very strange to them, you see, and the rest of it.
I have to.
And others, you see. Now, are you ready to start it?
Yeah.
Huh?
What was, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe some of the, because you had mentioned that for Mark, he was always in search of something beautiful in literature and so forth, and that there always seemed to be sort of a glow about him and what he thought about the world? Was there another edge to him that?
There was a glow to him, I'm not ashamed to say that glow meant a great deal to me. I don't find that glow anywhere these days. And he was a great example to me in that sense. He wasn't my model, but because for many reasons, not least the difference in background, I had other aims, the rest of it. But it's very important to understand that the greatest influence we had was on people directly at Columbia College who were writers, John Hollander and others, you see. The other day, I was at a symposium with John Hollander and Timothy Healy of the library, New York Public Library, on Thomas Hardy and Jared Manley Hopkins. And I was not surprised to hear Hollander say that he owed his fitting for Thomas Hardy to Mark Van Doren. There were a lot of writers here. Columbia was famous for its writers, but I can't tell you, who they all were. I think it'll be important to ask people like Hollander and others who were very much influenced by him. Now, you're going to ask me about other people at Columbia, like Lionel Trilling. Right. Trilling, without a doubt, has had the greatest influence on literary ideas, literary thinking of any Columbia professor of English, unlike Mark Van Doren, whose influence was never anything like that. And the reason is that Trilling was much more political, you see. The reason for Trilling's influence was, quite apart from his great talent and sensibility, was the fact that he was slowly moving from his early radical period. He had been dismissed from Columbia at one point for being a Marxian and a Freudian. And there was always a problem at Columbia in the early days because he was a Jew. Clifton Fadiman, the well-known critic who was in his class, was reading class, said to me bitterly many years later in California once, shows you how deep these things go, that he was just as smart as Trilling, had just as high an average, but when he hoped for a job in the English department, he was said, we have room for only one Jew, and we've picked Mr. Trilling. And Trilling was always self-conscious about this. Part of the problem that Trilling and I had together was the fact that, he wanted to fit in to an atmosphere. I understood this. He was Columbia and I was City College. And though they're only a few blocks apart, there's a universe of difference between them, you see. And Trilling's influence came because he was becoming more and more conservative. I'm just now writing, as a matter of fact, an introduction to a novelist, E.M. Forster, whom Trilling made famous in this country, and to a book which he made famous, the book called Howard's End, which is very much an allegory about England. And Trilling loved that kind of England, you see, and I couldn't share that kind of feeling about England. I had been there during the war. I knew too much about the English behind the beautiful Cambridge and Oxford thing here. But Trilling's influence was tremendous. And there's no question that he'll always be remembered, especially by his students, who are legion, because of that influence.
Yes, you brought up the point that about his Jewish background, and that I remember you writing in one of your books about how he was, the way that you in your literature bring up more of your Jewish background perhaps, and that he had a qualm with that because of his...
Well, you have to understand that Trilling was 10 years older than I. He went to Columbia at a time when it was simply not popular to be Jewish. The fact that people forget now, when Columbia has a Jewish president and Jews have a tremendous role in American culture and elsewhere, that there was a time when being Jewish was considered a stigma. For example, why was Dwight D. Eisenhower called Ike? It's because when he went to West Point, the early part of the century, his classmates thought his name, Eisenhower, was a Jewish name, a Swedish Jewish name, if you please, and called him Ike. And of course, later on, Ike became something very different. And I came out of a different background. My people were very much immigrants of the old style, without English, and so it was a different style. And of course, I was much closer to the struggles of the Jewish working class than Lionel Trilling was. This is a difference of age, and also a difference of temperaments, you see. Lionel Trilling loved to fish, something I cannot imagine myself doing. And he loved England. He loved the whole idea of being, in England as a professor at Oxford, which he was. And so, although I couldn't follow this, I understood it. But I also understood that it was a lesson for students at Columbia, see, in many ways, who became, under his influence, much more conservative. I think Trilling had one of the most profound influences on the neoconservative movement. There were a great many neoconservatives, meaning ex-radicals. A neoconservative is not a conservative, he's a Jewish ex-radical, as opposed to a real conservative, in my opinion. And he had tremendous influence on such people, and it's lasted very much so.
Well, you've always been interested in writers that do stretch themselves beyond the norm, and I remember you remarking about the 20s as being such an exciting time for literature, because there seemed to be, they could attack the Constitution if they wanted to, it didn't matter, and there was a freedom which it's been hard to recapture even now.
Absolutely. From the time I met writers of the 20s, when I started publishing in the 30s, I was just overwhelmed by their personal style. For one thing, they were all drinkers. They were very flamboyant, and they had an air about them. Now, in his own way, Mark Van Doren, who was not flamboyant, I think I made that clear, nevertheless was part of it. I forget where I read this or where I heard this, but when he came to New York to be at Columbia, or later on when he started teaching here rather, he and Joseph Wood Crutch, who was his closest friend, I believe, who also taught here, had an apartment on 8th Street, I believe, in the Village, and they painted the floor black. This was what the Village was like in those days, you see. And the people I knew of the 20s, people like Edmund Wilson and others, were utterly different from people my generation, who tended to be depression types and rather haunted by fear of failure and the rest of it. They had an air of freedom, which I thought was just marvelous, which I envied very deeply.
Well, what do you recall of Mark's close friend, Joseph Wood Crutch? Do you?
Joseph Wood Crutch was a Southerner from Tennessee, very dignified, very stately. I didn't know him particularly, but he wrote very interesting books he was the nation's theater critic, which was also part of the what you might call the Van Doren League. Even when you weren't from Van Doren, you got into the Van Doren League by writing for The Nation, you see. Which was a very different magazine from what it is now, of course.
That had a tremendous impact, The Nation did. What was it about it that was so influential?
It wasn't The Nation alone, it was the New Republic too. When I became literary editor, I started writing for the New Republic, and I became book editor briefly during the war, before I went overseas. And both these magazines were, especially in their book sections, tremendous influences, you see. The New Republic was actually a greater influence at the very beginning. Beginning in 1914, the New Republic was really at the very threshold of the modernist movement in American literature. There's a famous story about Robert Frost coming back from England in 1914. He had gone to England because he couldn't get published here. He couldn't find a public here. In England, he found a publisher and the rest. Then he came back because of the war. And the first thing he saw when he got off at the pier was an article about him in the New Republic, the first issue by Amy Lowell, heralding him as a great American poet, you see. The New Republic had a famous book page, the beginning of the book page. Any writer who was discussed in that book page somehow became important. And if you wrote such an article, you yourself as a critic became important, you see, the rest of it. Now, The Nation had another kind of influence, you see. Politically, well, I won't speak about the politics here. But among other things, will get me too mad. I don't feel like getting mad this morning about The Nation or the New Republic, which are now extreme left and virtually as right as you can get. But the literary sides were very important. And Mark Van Doren was also a movie critic for The Nation. I remember his movie reviews very well because he was always astonished by the beauty of films, but some of the films. Remember that this was long before people had replaced books with films. You know, films was still a sort of extra thing for people who love literature. I remember he once wrote about a Russian film he was reviewing, And he was absolutely fascinated by the postures of the hero in that thing. Yes, that's.
Do you recall the incident at the bar, at the Columbia bar that you had mentioned earlier?
Yes. You have to remember that Mark was an innocent liberal politically in many ways. There's part of his goodness that, unlike other people more politically experienced in New York, like Trilling, he didn't really take sides. He just wanted everybody's welfare in a way. Well, during the McCarthy period, which you know was a period of tremendous intolerance toward people who were not 100% anti-communist, Mark and a great many other American writers were pilloried in the pages of Life magazine as being soft on communism. It was terrible, you see. And remember, it was a 2-page spread which included Albert Einstein and Norman Mailer and a great many other people. Henry Luce had gone nuts on the subject of the American century, and that was the American century. And then, of course, came along Joe McCarthy from Wisconsin, who, before, thank God, he drank enough to land himself in the grave, which is the only relief we got from that guy, was making life truly miserable for people. And he was a big witch hunter, there was no other way of putting it. Well, anyway, I just remembered that one afternoon, Mark and I were sitting in one of the Columbia bars drinking beer. It was typical of Mark's sense of economy that I couldn't finish the beer. I got too mad at McCarthy, and he felt a little regretful. He had paid for 2 bottles of beer, one of which I didn't finish, you see. He was very tidy, very neat, and that sort of thing, you see. He wasn't given to extravagant gestures of any kind. But there we were, looking at McCarthy on the television screen, and it was pretty bad. And he was just shaking his head as if he couldn't believe that anybody could be such a bastard, you know.
You mentioned about the fact that he had tremendous humility and so forth. I guess that is different from a lot of the characters, the writers that are characters, that like Sinclair Lewis or Frost or even Whitman, who almost became known as much for their personalities as they did for their writings.
I wouldn't say that Mark Van Doren was humble. I would say he was modest. He knew his value very well. Humility is not the word I would use for him. But it's perfectly true, you see, that a great many writers and poets were real characters. I remember when I met Sinclair Lewis once in my life, he was an incredible drinker, you know. And there were a lot of people at that party, among them Joseph Wood Crutch. And Lewis finally got up a little shakily and said, "I've got to go home now so I can write tomorrow morning. And if I write, then Joe Crutch here can write about it, and someone else can write about it. They all write about me," that sort of thing. And it was a real spectacle, you know. And of course, later on, poets like Robert Lowell, who did not think highly of Mark Van Doren. I'm sure one reason was that Robert Lowell was such a character himself, you know. He was always up or down. And all these people, the 20s and 30s later on, but especially the 20s and 30s, were characters. They took themselves very seriously as characters. The only one of my generation or later who behaves that way is Norman Mailer, you know. And he's been a little quiet lately. He must be writing again.
Let us change to